Amid the vast arid plains of Texas lies a small, time-forgotten town where the nights are unnaturally silent, and the winds that blow across the prairie carry with them ancient, dark secrets. To outsiders, this is just another insignificant dot on the map, a barren and desolate land. But residents know there is something wrong there, something that keeps them trapped in a cycle of silence and fear. John, a lonely farmer, never believed the stories the ancients told about what lurked in the shadows of the night. For him, life was all about hard work, the sound of cattle in the distance and the stars that painted the night sky. But one July night, John's peaceful ranch would be the scene of something inexplicable and horrific, something that would change his life forever. While walking through the field at dawn, John noticed that one of his cows had fallen. He approached, hoping to find a common predator. However, upon seeing the scene before his eyes, a chill ran down his spine. The cow was completely bloodless, with a single puncture wound on its neck. John knew that this was not the work of a coyote or any other animal in the area. He didn't know what it was, but instinct told him one thing. It wasn't natural. The words of his elders began to echo in his mind, whispers of something that lives in the shadows, something that hunts, something that no one dares to name. And that night would be just the beginning. John always believed that country life was a refuge from the madness of the modern world. On the ranch where he grew up, time seemed to pass differently. Mornings were filled with the gentle sound of cattle in the distance and the rustle of the wind passing through the gnarled trees, as the sun slowly illuminated the vast expanse of land he called home. To many, John's life might seem lonely, but he was always comfortable in the company of his animals and the predictable routine of his days. His ranch, isolated miles from any big city, was his only world. He would wake up at dawn, feed the cattle, check the fences, and spend hours on the manual tasks that kept the farm running. At night, he sat on the porch of his wooden house, watching the infinite horizon, where the dark sky met the endless earth. The silence was welcoming, a constant in his life. When he was younger, he dreamed of traveling, seeing the world beyond Texas. But time passed, and now the farm was all he knew. It was a simple, even monotonous lifestyle. But it gave John a sense of control and purpose. He didn't have a large network of friends, and interactions with other people were sparse, usually limited to weekly trips to the small store in town to buy supplies or sell some livestock. Residents of the region knew him as a reserved man, of few words, but trustworthy. John didn't care about the gossip or the stories that spread among the townspeople. For him, rumors about strange phenomena or mysterious creatures were just distractions for those who had nothing else to do. Until that July morning, he had no reason to question the normality of his life. The death of the cow, with its precise wound and body drained of blood, was a profound shock. He stood before the animal, his eyes fixed on the inert corpse, trying to find a rational explanation, but the more he looked, the more the uneasiness grew in his chest. John knew the field like the back of his hand. He knew that coyotes, wolves, or even cougars attacked savagely, tearing the flesh from their prey. For this was different. That night he retired early, but sleep did not come. The stories he had heard over the years, whispers of creatures in the shadows, of unexplained attacks, haunted his thoughts, and in the silence of his room he asked himself, what if those stories were true? The following weeks were an increasing torment for John. Other animals began to die in the same mysterious way. Always at night, always with the same disturbing pattern. A small hole in the neck and the body completely drained of blood. He tried to ignore the fear that began to rise within him, attributing the deaths to some unknown predator, perhaps something he hadn't noticed before. But as the body count grew, it became increasingly difficult for John to maintain his calm facade. The loneliness that once brought him comfort now became a burden. Every noise on the ranch at night seemed amplified, every shadow seemed thicker and more menacing. John began sleeping with a shotgun next to his bed, getting up several times throughout the night to inspect the perimeter of the farm. But he never found anything. No footprints, no signs of intrusion, just more dead bodies at dawn. Frustrated and desperate, he decided to seek help in the small town nearby. At the hardware store, he talked to Hank, the owner, a gray-haired man who knew country life and the challenges that came with it. John described the animals' deaths, his suspicions that something unusual was at work. Hank listened silently, his face contorting into an expression of discomfort as the story progressed. "So I've heard that before," Hank said finally, his voice low. "I'm not the only one. Things like that happened years ago, further south. They say the government is involved, but who am I to know? But if I were you, I'd talk to the guy who knows these types of things. A hunter of things we don't see around." John frowned. He didn't believe in legends or conspiracy theories. But the reality he faced on the ranch seemed to defy any logic he knew, and so, reluctantly, he decided to follow Hank's advice and sought out the man many called an expert on weird things. The feeling that something far greater than he could comprehend was lurking on his ranch became unbearable. As he walked home, Hank's words echoed in his mind. Could there be some truth to ancient whispers about creatures that hunt in the shadows? John didn't know yet, but he was about to discover what really inhabited those forgotten lands. Nights at John's ranch, once peaceful, were now filled with a suffocating sense of vigilance and fear. Every noise, every movement on the field seemed amplified, as if something or someone was watching him. He tried to continue with his routine, but the restlessness slowly consumed him. Each morning was a repeating nightmare. More dead cows, the same disturbing pattern his mind, which had always prided itself on being rational and practical, was now beginning to be corroded by paranoia. Hank's words about the hunter specializing in strange things echoed in his head, and John found himself wondering if something supernatural or bizarre was actually lurking on the ranch. The possibility made him uneasy. As night fell, the darkness that was once his ally now seemed to envelop him like a predator. He began to avoid sleeping. The few hours of sleep he did get were interrupted by nightmares or the sound of something moving in the distance. His body, already tired from the physical demands of life in the countryside, began to give in to the weight of tension and fear. John began reinforcing the ranch's fences, as if that could stop whatever was outside from getting in. He installed more lights around the property and even tried to watch the field at night, armed and determined to face whatever was causing the chaos. But all he saw were dancing shadows, distorted by the flickering light, and a silence that seemed to mock his vigilance. Little by little, he began to avoid going to the city. The few interactions he had with neighbors or traders became strange and uncomfortable. John began to feel like everyone was looking at him differently, as if they knew something he didn't. The paranoia was like a poison that seeped into every aspect of his life, until the simplest things began to feel like threats. He no longer trusted anyone, and even worse, he was beginning to distrust himself. The ancient legends that he had once dismissed as nonsense now came to life in his thoughts. Could it be that the ranch, the land he found so familiar, was actually harboring something sinister, something beyond human comprehension? The endless nights continued to suffocate his sanity, and the feeling of helplessness consumed him. Fear had set in for good, and John knew he couldn't go on like this much longer. He needed answers, or he would be swallowed up in the silent terror spreading across the ranch. The decision to seek help, despite being reluctant, seemed to be the only option left for John. Every day, the number of dead animals increased, and reality became darker. He contacted the hunter Hank had mentioned, and the response was quick, almost immediate, as if the man had already expected it. When he finally arrived at the ranch, his presence was as intriguing as it was disconcerting. The hunter was tall, thin, and silent. His face, marked by the sun and experience, carried an expression of cold professionalism. The piercing eyes observed everything around them with calculated attention, as if they were reading invisible secrets in the landscape. He didn't say much when he met John, limiting himself to a discreet nod before examining the bodies of the dead cows. The way he moved, almost like a predator, gave John a chill. This man was clearly no ordinary person. The hunter crouched down beside one of the cows, his deft fingers analyzing the body. After a long silence, he stood up and approached John. "This is not the work of coyotes or wolves," said the hunter, his voice deep and steady. "What you have here is something much more dangerous." John, still skeptical, asked for more explanation. The hunter took a deep breath before speaking, and what he said was disturbing. He revealed that the creature responsible for the attacks was not natural. It was a chupacabra, a legendary beast that feeds on blood. But the most disturbing thing came next. The hunter claimed that the chupacabra was the result of a government experiment that went horribly wrong. The story sounded absurd, but the look in the hunter's eyes made it clear that he believed every word he said. He showed photos of similar attacks in other parts of the world, especially in Puerto Rico, where the creature was first spotted. The images, dark and out of focus, showed a creature with red eyes and scaly skin, terrifying and incomprehensible. John was on the verge of disbelief. But the reality around him, the bodies of his cows, the oppressive feeling of being watched, forced him to accept the truth. The hunter proposed a solution. Use one of his cows as bait to try to attract the creature. The idea made him uncomfortable, but the feeling that he had no more options prevailed. So they began to prepare the trap meticulously, with kerosene lights and night vision cameras. The tension in the air was palpable. That night, something would be revealed. Whatever was hunting on John's ranch would now be hunted too. The night of the ambush arrived enveloped in a blanket of suffocating darkness. The stars that once illuminated the vast plains of Texas were now obscured by dense clouds, and the silence was so thick that even the rustle of the wind felt like an intrusion. John and the hunter were positioned behind a small hill, watching the cow tied to the lamppost from afar. The creature, the chupacabra, had become John's only obsession, not just because of the threat to his life and his farm, but because what was happening was forcing him to confront everything he believed to be real. The hunter, calm and unfazed, adjusted his sniper rifle, equipped with night vision. John, on the other hand, was a mix of nervousness and determination. Kerosene lights flickered softly around the area where the cow was, and cameras captured every second of waiting. The silence of the night only increased the tension, making John's heart beat like a drum. Suddenly, something changed. A soft, barely audible sound cut through the silence. The faint rustle of something moving in the shadows. The hunter, without looking away from the scope, gave a small gesture for John to stay quiet. They both held their breath, their eyes fixed on the cow that remained motionless in the center of the field, another movement in the shadows. Then the creature appeared. The first thing John noticed were the eyes, red like burning coals glowing in the darkness. The creature moved with disconcerting speed and agility, circling the cow before leaping at it with deadly precision. The sound of the attack was swift and brutal. The hunter, prepared, reacted in an instant. The shot echoed across the field, and the creature fell inert. With shaking hands, John and the hunter slowly approached. When the lights revealed the creature's body, John found himself in front of something that looked like something out of a nightmare. It was smaller than he imagined, with scaly skin and elongated limbs, but the most disturbing thing was his age. It was a puppy. If that's a cub, the hunter said, his voice cold, then the adults are out there, and they're much more dangerous. Before John could process what he had just heard, the sound of shrill howls cut through the air, coming from the dense forest surrounding the ranch. The hunter raised his head, eyes alert as the howls intensified. John felt a chill run down his spine, the feeling that they were being watched the entire time growing with every second. He looked at the hunter, waiting for a reaction, but the man was already moving. "We need to retreat now," the hunter said firmly, pulling John toward the house. "They're coming." The sound of branches breaking and leaves being dragged approached quickly. John, his heart pounding in his chest, followed the hunter toward the safety of the house. When they looked back, what they saw took their breath away. Dozens of red eyes shone in the darkness of the forest, like small malevolent stars that chased them. There were many, much more than either of them expected. The hunter barely had time to close the door before the first creatures began to attack. They were fast, agile, climbing the walls of the house and slamming against the windows with a force that seemed impossible for such small beings. John grabbed the shotgun he kept next to the door, firing at one of the windows, while the hunter used his rifle to keep the chupacabras at bay. The sound of gunshots echoed through the house, but it seemed useless. For each creature knocked down, two more appeared from the shadows. The creatures attacked with unbridled fury, breaking windows, clawing at walls and trying to force open doors. John, breathing heavily, retreated to the center of the house, feeling adrenaline flood his body. The hunter, still focused, gave quick orders, trying to keep the situation under control. But it was clear to both that they were at a disadvantage. John's house, which had always been his refuge, now seemed like a death trap. The creatures finally managed to break through one of the windows and began to invade the interior of the house. John fired once more, but was attacked by one of the beasts who knocked him to the ground, its sharp claws tearing his skin. The pain was excruciating, but before the creature could deliver the final blow, the hunter acted, shooting the chupacabra and saving John's life. Seriously injured, John knew they couldn't hold out much longer. They were surrounded, and the creatures were about to take control of the house. The hunter's gaze met John's, and without saying a word, they both realized that the fight was far from over. The minutes dragged by like hours. John, injured and exhausted, struggled to remain calm as the chaos around him intensified. The hunter remained on his feet, firing with deadly precision at the approaching creatures. But even he knew the situation was quickly spiraling out of control. John's home, once his sanctuary, was now a prison, with the walls vibrating with each impact of the creatures. John felt the blood drain from his wound as he crawled to a safe corner, trying to catch his breath. The sound of claws scratching the wood of the house, the screams of the chupacabras and the crack of windows breaking filled the air. The horror of that night was palpable. an overwhelming force that seemed to close in on them, squeezing their hearts and minds. It was then that, in a rare moment of calm between attacks, something caught the hunter's attention. He had shot down one of the creatures that had invaded the living room, but as he approached the body, he noticed something strange. Crouching down, he pulled the creature's corpse closer to the light and, with a look of deep uneasiness, examined its features. John, even weak, noticed the change in the hunter's expression. "That's impossible," muttered the hunter almost to himself. John, struggling to his feet, approached. What he saw made him take his breath away. The creature wasn't just a chupacabra. Beneath the scaly skin and red eyes were vaguely human features. The body, although distorted, showed signs of mutilation and experimentation. The hunter pointed to precise scars on the creature's abdomen, as if it had been opened and reconfigured by human hands. "These aren't just wild animals," said the hunter, his voice filled with dark gravity. "They were created, or transformed." John felt a wave of horror course through his body. What he was facing wasn't just a natural threat. These creatures were the products of something much more sinister, experiments gone horribly wrong. And worse, if these were just puppies, as the hunter had suggested, it meant there was an even darker purpose behind their creation. The weight of this discovery was unbearable, but there was no time to process it. Outside, the howls of adult chupacabras echoed through the night. They knew the puppies were dead. And now, they were furious. Before they could react, the attack intensified. The adults finally revealed themselves, and what John and the hunter had faced so far seemed almost like a game compared to what was to come. The windows burst with enormous force, and the screams of the adult creatures were much more ferocious and terrifying. The adult chupacabras were bigger, stronger, and their scaly skin reflected the dim moonlight that filtered through the destroyed house. The creatures' red eyes cut through the darkness like beacons from hell, and their slender bodies moved with a speed that defied logic. The hunter, always prepared for the worst, now seemed to be struggling to maintain control of the situation. He fired with deadly precision, but for every creature that fell, two more appeared from the shadows like a swarm of nightmares. John, even weak, forced himself to fight. He grabbed his shotgun and fired at one of the creatures that was trying to break through the kitchen door. The recoil of the weapon made his injured arm throb with pain, but he ignored the suffering, focused only on surviving that cursed night. Each shot echoed through the house like a cry of despair, but the number of creatures didn't seem to decrease. The doors began to give way, and the creatures invaded the house en masse. The acrid smell of blood and death hung in the air as John and the hunter fought for their lives. The hunter, now sweating and panting, shouted to John, "We must retreat! We can't hold this!" Both retreated to the upper floor of the house, blocking the stairs with heavy furniture and whatever else they could find. The sound of the creatures destroying everything downstairs was deafening. John could hear his furniture being smashed, glass breaking, and the chupacabra's claws scratching the wood with incomparable ferocity. As they positioned themselves on the upper floor, the hunter set up a last line of defense, his mind calculating each possibility. But John knew they were running out of options. The house was being consumed by the creatures, and time was against them. The fear in the air was almost tangible, a suffocating presence that tightened your chest by the second. It was then that, suddenly, everything stopped. The silence that followed was even more terrifying than the attack. The howling stopped, and the sounds of the creatures destroying the house disappeared. John and the hunter exchanged a confused look, not understanding what had happened. They waited, tense, their breath caught in their chests, but there was no more sound. It was as if suddenly the creatures had disappeared, but deep down they both knew that this wasn't the end, just the beginning of something much darker. The silence that hung over the ranch was thick and suffocating. John and the hunter remained motionless on the upper floor, their bodies tense, awaiting the creature's next move. However, the attack did not resume. Whatever had made the chupacabras retreat had also brought an even more unsettling sense of anticipation. Something bigger was coming. Minutes passed, and the silence persisted. Then the distinct sound of propellers cutting through the air reached his ears. John slowly stood up, peering out the window. In the distance, several black helicopters flew over the ranch, moving in a coordinated and fast manner. The hunter next to John sighed heavily. "That's what I feared," he murmured. Before they could react, helicopters landed nearby and men dressed in biosafety suits quickly emerged, advancing across the field. There were dozens of them, moving with military precision. Powerful weapons were in their hands, and in a matter of minutes, the men spread out across the ranch, surrounding the house. John and the hunter exchanged looks. They knew this was much bigger than either of them had imagined. A firm knock on the door echoed through the destroyed house. John, still shaken by the attack, hesitated before opening the door. Outside, an officer dressed in an impeccable uniform and an impenetrable countenance looked straight at him. "Sir," said the officer with a cold tone, "we have come to contain the situation. From now on, we are in control." John, confused and exhausted, tried to question what was happening, but the officer didn't elaborate. Instead, he gestured for the other officers to begin sweeping the area. They quickly surrounded the house, removing the creatures' bodies with surgical dexterity. Any evidence of the attack was carefully collected, as if it had never happened. Decontamination equipment was set up, and the agents worked in silence, erasing any trace of the Chupacabra's presence. The hunter, with his arms crossed, watched everything with a mixture of frustration and resignation. He knew this type of operation. "They're going to erase everything," he said to John with a defeated tone. "They can't allow this to get out of here." John, still in shock, tried to process what he saw. The agents, now spread throughout the ranch, not only cleaned the creatures' bodies, but also monitored John and the hunter. The ranch had turned into a scene of total control, where the truth was being systematically erased. In the days that followed, John tried to get his life back on track. But the reality of his situation was inescapable. The government had imposed a kind of silence on him and the ranch. Although he was still free to come and go, the feeling of being constantly watched was undeniable. During the day, mysterious men in black cars were seen on nearby roads, parking in strategic places, as if waiting for John to slip up. At night, the same car would appear in front of his house, parking silently without ever leaving the spot. The paranoia, which had already taken hold of John before, now intensified. He barely slept. And when he did, nightmares about the creatures and the attack on the ranch woke him up in a cold sweat. The feeling of being watched at all times was suffocating, a constant reminder that the government was determined to keep everything secret. He tried to carry on with the ranch's daily tasks, but his every move seemed monitored, and his life became an endless cycle of anxiety. The hunter, who had disappeared after the government operation, had warned him about what could happen. "They'll make sure you don't talk," he had said, "and if you try to expose what you saw, it will be the end for you." John tried not to think about it, but reality haunted him. He knew he was in a dangerous position. He knew that any attempt to reveal what really happened that night could cost him his life. The city, once an occasional refuge, now seemed hostile. The few times John dared to leave his property, he felt strange looks from neighbors and merchants. No one spoke openly about what had happened at the ranch, but it was clear that rumors were circulating. People looked at him curiously, and some even seemed afraid. Isolation, which had previously been John's choice, was now imposed. He was trapped in his own home under the constant surveillance of forces he could not control. Each night that passed, the black car remained parked on the other side of the road with its headlights off and its occupants invisible but present. John knew he was being watched closely, waiting for any movement that would warrant more drastic action. Ranch life, once peaceful, was now a minefield of fear and uncertainty. John began to question whether he would ever be able to escape the shadow the government had cast over him, or whether the ranch would be his prison until the end of his days. The days passed slowly, and the feeling of being constantly monitored consumed John's mind. Each night, the black car remained there, a grim reminder that he was trapped in an invisible web, silenced by an unspoken threat. He knew the government wanted to keep the ranch incident buried, like so many other truths that would never come to light. But John also knew that if he continued to remain silent, he would carry this burden forever. One morning, when he got up, he made a decision that would change everything. The weight of the silence was unbearable, and he knew he couldn't continue living under the shadow of fear. The truth needed to be told regardless of the consequences. He had lost so much. His peace, his confidence, his security. He was not willing to lose his dignity. John began gathering evidence. He searched the house for anything that had escaped government agents. In a hidden drawer at the back of a closet, he found a small brown envelope. Inside were the photos he had taken that horrible night. Moments before the helicopters arrived, the images, blurry and shadowy, clearly showed the Chupacabras, their red eyes glowing in the shadows, their sharp claws digging into the cows. These photos were his only physical proof that something truly supernatural had happened there. With renewed determination, John fired up his old laptop. He knew that exposing the truth would put him in danger, but at the same time, he knew that there were ways to disclose information anonymously. The internet, although also monitored, was still a place where he could find echo for his story. He spent hours writing down every detail of the night of the attack, every step the government took to cover up the existence of the creatures. The truth raw and frightening, was finally ready to be shared. When he finished, John felt a wave of anxiety pass through his body. He was about to do something that couldn't be undone. With shaking hands, he uploaded the photos and the report to an anonymous blog, pressing the Publish button. The words were now out in the world, and for a brief moment, he felt relief. However, he knew that this relief would be short-lived. Retaliation would be inevitable. That same night, after posting the photos and report online, John expected something different, maybe the feeling of freedom that came with the truth, or even the emptiness that often followed a defining moment. Instead, he was overcome by a growing tension, a feeling that something terrible was about to happen. It didn't take long for his fears to come true. He looked out the window of the ranch and saw the black car parked in the distance again, but this time, there was something different. The lights were on, and he could clearly see two silhouettes inside the vehicle. John's heart quickened. Until that moment, the car's occupants had remained in the shadows, invisible, but now they seemed ready to act. The simple change in the car's behavior was a clear sign. His publication had not gone unnoticed. John tried to remain calm, but panic began to take over. He knew he had little time before the government, or whoever was involved, took steps to silence him for good. The men in black were ruthless, and John was convinced they would not hesitate to do whatever was necessary to ensure the secret remained buried. He locked all the doors and windows, but he knew that wouldn't be enough to stop them. He picked up the phone, thinking about calling someone, asking for help. But who? He was isolated, surrounded by a conspiracy few would believe. The hunter, the only person who knew the truth, had disappeared. No one in the city would believe him, and even if they did, would they dare defy them? With shaking hands, John resignedly put the phone back down. I was alone in this fight. Suddenly, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed outside the house. John ran to the nearest window and saw three men getting out of the black car, moving towards the house. Their figures were indistinct, but there was something menacing in their posture. They moved with purpose, as if they knew exactly what to do. Panic hit John like a crushing wave. He ran into his room, grabbing the shotgun he always kept hidden in a corner. His body was tense, his breathing uneven. I knew what was about to happen was inevitable. The men were there to silence him, and he would have to fight for his life. As the footsteps approached, John felt the weight of his decision. I had exposed the truth, but now the price to be paid would be high. The tension in the air was almost palpable, and the sound of a firm knock on the door echoed through the house. They were there, and they weren't going to leave until they finished what they came to do. The knocking on the door became more insistent. John, with the shotgun in his hands, felt the sweat running down his forehead as the noises outside intensified. He knew he was at a disadvantage. Those men, whoever they were, weren't there to talk. They were prepared for any resistance he might offer. John's breathing was heavy. His heart was racing. He moved through the house carefully, trying to maintain control, knowing that every second could be his last. On the other side of the door, he heard muffled voices, coordinating their movements. They were preparing something, and it wasn't difficult to imagine what it would be. One of the men spoke in an authoritative tone, as if he was instructing the others. John felt the weight of inevitability descend upon him. There was no way out of this without a confrontation. He looked around his house, the wooden walls that had for so long been his refuge. Now they were the scene of a battle for survival. Suddenly, the sound of something metallic being clicked into place outside made John brace himself. He knew they were about to force their way in, then with a bang that reverberated throughout the house, the door was broken down. The men dressed in black invaded quickly, moving with precision. John fired the shotgun, the deafening noise echoing through the house's narrow hallways. The first shot hit one of the invaders, but the others scattered quickly, moving with a skill that John could never match. The confrontation was quick and brutal. John tried to fight, but the men were well-trained, moving with ruthless efficiency. Within minutes, he was subdued, knocked to the ground with a strong blow. The shotgun was ripped from his hands, and he felt a knee press into his spine, forcing him violently to the ground. "You shouldn't have spoken," one of the men whispered, his voice cool and controlled. "Now we need to make sure you never do it again." John, without the strength to react, just listened to the words, feeling the pain spread throughout his body. He knew he had lost this battle, but still, he felt he had done what was right. He had exposed the truth, and even if they tried to erase it, the seed had already been planted. As darkness began to take over his vision, John wondered if the sacrifice had been in vain, but deep down he knew there was a chance, however small, that his story wouldn't be forgotten. And that in itself was enough. John woke up hours later, feeling numb and heavy. The pain was excruciating, but the worst part wasn't physical. When he looked around, he saw that his house had been completely searched. Drawers, furniture, everything was overturned. The documents and photos he had hidden were gone. The men in black had taken everything, erasing any trace of what he had gathered. Everything he fought for seemed to have been destroyed. He crawled over to his laptop, expecting the worst. When he turned it on, he discovered that his blog had been removed, the post deleted. Every trace of the truth he had tried to disclose had been erased in a matter of hours. It was as if none of that had happened, as if the government had managed once again to hide the truth beneath a dense curtain of secrecy. Despair took over John. He felt the crushing weight of defeat, the feeling that all his struggle had been in vain. However, as he contemplated his situation, something unexpected happened. His phone, silent for days, vibrated. It was a notification from a social network. Someone, somewhere, had reposted her photos and her story before they were deleted. John opened his browser and saw that his story was starting to gain traction on obscure forums, deep within the internet. People started sharing the images, discussing the chupacabras and the government's involvement. Conspiracy theories arose, but among them were those who believed. People who knew the truth. John realized that despite the government's efforts, it had managed to plant the seed of doubt, and now it was blossoming. He knew that although the men in black had taken their evidence, the truth no longer belonged to them. It was loose, circulating on the internet, beyond the control of those who wanted to silence it. He had risked everything to let the world know what was happening, and now he could no longer go back. History was alive. John smiled. Even through the pain, he knew the consequences would come, that his life would never be the same. But deep down he felt at peace. He had done what needed to be done. His legacy was now in the hands of the public, and it was only a matter of time before more people started investigating. With one last sigh of relief, John turned off the computer. The battle wasn't over yet, but at least he was no longer fighting alone. The world knew the truth, and that was what really mattered. So everyone, this was the story of John and the fight to expose the truth about the mysteries on the ranch. If you liked this tense and suspenseful narrative, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. This really helps the channel grow and brings more incredible stories like this to you. And if you have any theories or ideas about what happened to John, leave them in the comments. Until next time.